Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We learned previously about the structure of the Shulchan Lechem Hapanim, the table of the Showbread, and we learned about the method of the arrangement of the loaves of bread on the table. As we move closer towards the conclusion of the third chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira in the Rambam, Maimonides has one remaining halacha in this chapter pertaining to the table. Now that we've learned about the structure and the arrangement, he has some information for us which is procedural regarding the way the breads are brought in and out of service. So in halacha number 16, Tet Zayin, we read, Ushne shulchanot hayu ba'ulam mibifnim al petach habayit. In the outer hall of the Heichal, there were two tables. So after having come through the great gate of the Dvir, of the sanctuary itself, we have a hall called the Ulam before coming into the area known as the Kodesh, the Heichal. Now we haven't learned very much so far about this Ulam, but if you recall, back in the first chapter of the Rambam, in Perek Aleph, in Halacha Hey, Maimonides told us Ve'eluhen hadvarim shehen ikar bebinyan habayit. When he was defining for us those components that are the integral parts of the structure of building the Holy Temple, there he mentioned Osin bo kodesh ve'kodesh hakodashim v'yeh lifnei hakodesh makom echad v'hu hanikra ulam u'shloshtan nikra'en heichal. Way back when, in the beginning of our studies, in the first chapter, in Halacha Hey, we learned that the Rambam tells us these are the major integral components of the Holy Temple, the Holy Area and the Holy of Holies. And then before the Holy of Holies, there is one place called the Ulam, which we can translate as the outer hall. And the three of them together, the Ulam, the Kodesh, and the Kodesh Kodashim, the hall, the Holy Area, and the Holy of Holies are together called the Heichal, the sanctuary. Now, later on, we're going to learn a little bit more detail about this Ulam. Again, we really haven't learned any of the dimensions yet. We're going to be learning in the fourth chapter of the Rambam. There in Halacha Chet, we're going to learn that the entrance to the Ulam was 40 amot and its width was 20 amot, and as opposed to all of the other gates in the building of the temple, there were no doors on the entranceway to the Ulam, but we'll learn that there was in fact a curtain. So this is a very specific area at the beginning, as it were, of the Heichal itself. And here, the Rambam tells us we will find that there are two special tables. Echad shel shayish, notnin alav lechem hapanim biknisato. One is made of marble, and the loaves of the lechem hapanim, the showbread, are placed upon entrance into service. The loaves are placed on this marble table. Ve'echad shel zahav notnin alav lechem bitziato. And another table of gold is designated to receive the breads that are now going out of service. Shemalin bakodesh v'lo moridin, because there is a principle in Jewish law that once something has become sanctified, we are looking for ever-increasing sanctity, and we never go down a level or drop a notch in sanctity. So what are we talking about here exactly? In this area called the Ulam, and this is based actually on a Mishnah in the 11th Perek of Tractate Menachot. This is where the Rambam is bringing us this information, recording it from. We have two tables in the Ulam, and these are especially designated for the job of facilitating the placement and replacement of the breads of the showbread. They have no other purpose, and the rest of the week they are sitting empty. These are especially for the showbreads. So, the Talmud tells us in Tractate Tamid that when the breads were prepared on Friday, and the new breads, the new loaves, the 12 loaves, were always prepared on Friday. So they were baked, and they were placed on this marble table in stacks, 2 stacks of 6. And the purpose of the marble table was that because the nature of marble is that it does not retain heat, so the chalot were placed there after baking, before it was time to put them on the table. And the marble, being the fact that it's cool and it stays cool, it's facilitated in seeing to it that the breads would not become steamy and moldy. Again, this aspect, not necessarily miraculous, but rather an aspect of great wisdom, because there are 2 factors that we find described in the words of our sages constantly regarding the fabulous nature of the showbread. One is that, amazingly, it never became moldy, so that a week later, when the breads were replaced with new ones, at the time of the incoming shift of the priestly watch, it was found that the breads were fresh, like the moment that they were placed there. And in fact, the outgoing shift of Kohanim were given a portion of that bread, as we already learned, as each man received a very small portion of the bread to eat. But 2 things are recorded. One is that they were never moldy, and the other, though, is that, amazingly, the breads were found to be fresh and hot, piping hot, like the moment that they were placed there. I believe that one thing that we see from really examining these sources is that there are 2 different tracks that are being addressed. The family whose job it was to prepare these breads, who had the special tradition and secret of exactly how to prepare these breads, their methodology, which was zealously guarded, it was really an issue of wisdom and experience and great knowledge and expertise in baking these breads. And they are credited with the knowledge of how to produce such perfect breads. And one of the aspects of their great knowledge, apparently, is that they knew how to prevent the breads, they knew how to prepare the bread in such a way that they were never going to become spoiled. And we're going to learn, hopefully today, all about the nature of that family, who they were, and what that wisdom was, as much as we can share, of course, and even have access to from our sources. But the other aspect of this manifestation, the heat aspect, as we've already mentioned previously, that was something that was a message from on high. That was clearly a theme of the Holy Temple altogether, that the Master of the Universe, through the medium, the vehicle of the bread, was able to convey yet another layer of the symbol, of the meaning of what's going on here in the temple in the first place. That because this is the place of total constant renewal, total constant freshness, if you would, and rejuvenation, it stands to reason that anything that is that closely associated with the presence of God and that actually is commanded to stand in the face of the divine presence is not going to have a spoilage problem, not going to become moldy. If only we would be on that level where every day our enthusiasm, our service of God, our excitement would be such that it would retard any spoilage and anything getting old, meaning commonplace. And that is this deep level of understanding of what the secret of the anti-mold, the anti-cooling effect of the breads were. So that, I think, is clear from our sages, that when they came and found it a week later that it was still hot, that was attributed to the hand of Hashem. That is more miraculous. That was not the wisdom of the bakers to keep it hot for a whole week, but there was an aspect of the wisdom of the bakers to keep it not moldy. And here we see, in fact, it's recorded by our sages that the very purpose, the very purpose of placing the breads that had just been baked on Friday onto the marble table was that this was one more aspect of retarding any sort of spoiling, because it helped them to cool. And the other table in the ulam was made of gold, because you see, the loaves, the 12 loaves, were switched at the time of the changing of the mishmeret kuhuna, of the priestly watch. Once a week on Shabbat, the shift of those that are serving in the temple, because you know there are many Kohanim that may that may reside anywhere in the land of Israel, and they are divided according to their fathers' clans, essentially, so that we have a system that is described by our sages where there are actually 24 specific watches or shifts of the priests, and these men would basically take a turn of a week at a time in the Holy Temple, and they would be in charge of all of the divine service during the time of their shift. And it was a Shabbat when the shifts would change, and at the time of the changing of the watch or the duty of the Kohanim, that is when the breads would actually physically be changed on the table, although they were prepared, baked on Friday. And after they were baked and came out of their forms and they were baked in the oven, they were brought into the ulam and they were placed to cool on the marble table, where they remained there until Shabbat, until it was time for them to be changed. And at that time, the 12 loaves of the previous week were brought out, and they were placed on the golden table. And that is actually, according to the Mishnah in Tractate Menachot, that is only done after the two censers of frankincense that we discussed, that are placed on the table between the loaves. On Shabbat, the contents of those censers, the frankincense, is going to actually be offered up on the altar, and at that time, the portions of the previous week's loaves are distributed. So the Rambam tells us regarding the fact that the loaves from the previous week were placed on this golden table, that there's a principle which we can read more about in the Jerusalem Talmud in Tractate Shkalim. It's called Malin Bakodesh Velo Moridin. And when it comes to matters of sanctity, when it comes to something that has been considered to be made holy, we always ascend and we never descend. And therefore, very simply put, since the 12 breads of the previous week had already sat on the golden table of the showbread, then it would be a blemish, as it were, for the honor of the commandment. It would be distasteful. It would be a step down for them to be placed on something more mundane than gold, even though they are about to be distributed to the outgoing shift of the Kohanim, and you might think that their title or their classification of holiness no longer applies to them, because they are now basically being retired. They are going into pension because they are being removed from the table. Still in all, there is this principle, Malin Bakodesh Velo Moridin, that we always ascend in levels of holiness. We never descend, and it would be a step down for them to be placed on any other surface, and therefore the gold table is specifically designated to receive the loaves that have been removed from the table. And this is the only thing that the Rambam has to add in the set of halachot that we have learned regarding the table of the showbread. And we have a couple of halachot remaining in this chapter that no longer apply to the table. So I would like to now share with you some more information about the concept of the showbread, because it is so important and one of the central parts of the service. And as far as the halachot, the references, the entrances that Maimonides has in this chapter, he's basically completed everything that he would like to share with us about the table. But scattered in some of the other sources of our rabbis, some that Maimonides has already quoted thus far, and some others, we have some more information regarding the concept of the showbread. And obviously some questions come to mind that it would be good if we would be able to answer. For example, who were the people that were entrusted with the baking of the showbread? Where was it done? And we actually have some very fascinating traditions regarding this concept. And beginning with a Mishnah, actually, in Tractate Shkalim, we have a very interesting listing of some very specific personalities at different periods in the temple that were responsible, that were overseeing different projects and different departments in the temple. It's Mishnah in chapter 5 of Shkalim, where we read the names of some personalities these people were called the Mimunin. That is to say, they were like the overseers in the Holy Temple of various aspects of the service. There's someone called Yochanan ben Pinchas, who is the overseer on the Chotamot, on the seals. There's someone called Achia, who is the overseer on the libations. Matitya ben Shmuel was the one who was the overseer on the lottery. All of these men are Kohanim, and they were given these responsibilities. And here in this Mishnah, in Tractate Shkalim, we are told that Beit Garmu, so this is not an individual, but this is an entire family. This is a division of the Kohanim. Beit Garmu are responsible for the baking of the showbread and actually every aspect of the production of the showbread. Beit Garmu, the house of Garmu, the dynasty of Garmu. And also there is another family that is mentioned, Beit Avtinas, the house of Avtinas, the family, the dynasty of Avtinas, were the ones who were given over the responsibility of the incense, everything about the incense. These two particular aspects of the service are really somewhat mysterious. There are some aspects of their production that are quite frankly, apparently not recorded, and that were handed down orally within the ranks of these particular families. And actually, regarding Beit Garmu, we have some very interesting traditions that are mentioned in various places in the oral tradition. This Beit Garmu, apparently, they were extremely experts in everything about the showbread, and every member of this family was apprenticed to the elders of the clan, and they were given over this very special knowledge of how to make the showbread. And here again, according to our master Maimonides, who has a very specific approach to these things, he explains that their expertise was quite technical. And in his commentary on Tractate Yoma, his Rambam's commentary can be found in the 3rd chapter of Tractate Yoma, Mishnah 11. He actually explains the details of this expertise. What was it about Beit Garmu that is known to be so accomplished regarding the whole process of the showbread? And he explains that the concept of how the baking was done in these special forms and how the dough was folded, like the Rambam calls it, like the folding of clothing, and how it was done so that it was totally even, and that the baking was absolutely perfect. All of these aspects of the concept, the art, as it were, of the baking was something that was known very well by them. And elsewhere it's recorded that part of this apparently had to do also somehow in those days yet with the concept of preventing mold. And we know that there were no external ingredients that were added in those days, and perhaps specifically because of the miracle of the fact that it stayed hot all week, this was a particular problem, that it should not, that the heat should not produce moisture and should not cause it to become moldy. Apparently this is something that Beit Garmu knew exactly, as we're going to see, how to prevent. But interestingly, the Rambam describes their expertise as being extremely technical in its nature. It was something that was studied and learned and passed down from father to son, and it was not shared with anyone else. And here's where it really gets very interesting, because at one point in history, the sages of blessed memory, and perhaps the elders of the priesthood, became extremely annoyed with the Garmu family because they were so totally zealous in their guarding of the secret. And the sages felt that it was not a becoming attribute for them, that they would not share the secret. What if something happens? What if it's at some point it's needed to be known, and why should it not be like any other part of Torah knowledge, which is not limited to one particular family? And we read in a very interesting passage in the Jerusalem Talmud, in Tractate Shkalim, that Beit Garmu, who were very, very expert, this family who were very expert in the production of the showbread, one of the aspects of their expertise was in the cooling process, of how it was transferred from the baking pans to the next step. And the sages, the wise men, were very concerned themselves with having an understanding of this process. And the Garmu family said, absolutely not. We will not tell you how we do it. It's a secret that our fathers taught us, and we have no permit whatsoever to share it with you. And this is why we find in Mishnah, it's mentioned that the Garmu family were actually, they were somewhat criticized for this at one point in the beginning, until the sages of blessed memory understood what their motivation was. First, the Garmu family was highly criticized for this obstinance in not wanting to share the information. So, you know, in many ancient sources there are references to the wisdom of Alexandria in ancient times. Alexandria, Egypt, was known to be a place of great learning. And even today, the concept of the library at Alexandria, if you look it up, is a concept of a center of tremendous wisdom and understanding and learning and knowledge from all over the world. And the Talmud actually tells us here, the Jerusalem Talmud tells us that the sages were so annoyed with the Garmu family for not wanting, for refusing to share their secret of how to produce the perfect showbread, that they sent away to men in Alexandria to come and duplicate the process, because apparently Alexandria was the place of all knowledge, and there could be found experts in every area. So, seeing that the Garmu family was obstinate and would not share the knowledge, the sages sent a message to send some accomplished bakers. There were artisans of every sort in Alexandria to come and duplicate the great accomplishment of the Garmu family in the production of the bread. And according to this anecdote, which is related in the Jerusalem Talmud, the craftsmen from Alexandria came, and they, in fact, yes, they had the ability to duplicate some aspects of the baking of the Garmu family, but they could not duplicate the rest of the process of the removal and the cooling, and they absolutely had no idea how it could possibly be done, and they couldn't do it. So then it was at that point that the wise men of the temple realized that there's something up here, and that the Garmu family had some sort of blessing from Hashem himself to be able to do this. And they realized, in fact, it was at that point that they actually stated that obviously there is an issue here of the honor of the Holy One, blessed be He, and that this is an aspect of the honor of the Holy One, blessed be He. So when they saw that the secret, whatever it was, of the expertise of the Garmu family could not be duplicated by the great Gentile craftsmen, bakers of Alexandria, they sent back to the Garmu family words of consolation. In other words, they wanted to reinstate them to their original position. But the Garmu family were very insulted, and at first refused the call. And finally, the sages upped their wages and apologized, and the Garmu family were reinstated. And it was at that point that they were asked by the sages, "What is it that you don't want to know? Why is it that you are so secretive about your knowledge? Why don't you want to share it. And it was at that point that they said that we have a tradition that our forefathers shared with us, that one day the Holy Temple is going to be destroyed. And our concern is that if this knowledge becomes public and other people learn how to produce the showbread, why then the situation may arise in which idolaters and all sorts of horrible houses of idolatrous worship also will start creating something like the showbread and use it for God forbid, for their idolatrous cults and for their false gods. And that would be a terrible desecration of Hashem's name, that which was used for His honor and His commandment in the Holy Temple should fall prey to idolaters, and therefore we don't want to share it. And then the sages truly understood that their motivation was the highest and came from the honor of the Master of the Universe, and they did not want that secret to be known, so it could not be abused. But it is stated in the same passage in the Jerusalem Talmud that the Garmu family, they never were able to produce a perfect loaf of bread for themselves, that no one in their family ever baked a nice loaf of bread in their own house, and that was an aspect of their greatness, that no one should ever say that the Garmu family used the secret of the showbread for their own enjoyment. In their own house, their breads never came out straight. So we're going to continue learning more about the bread of the showbread, representing blessing of the divine presence, the light to Israel and the light to the nations.